A fateful evening before Christmas. It was a chilly evening on December 15, 2005, in the quiet, snow-covered town of Windsor. Christmas was just around the corner, and the small town buzzed with the warmth of festive lights, bustling preparations, and merry gatherings. The evening was calm, streets lined with decorated storefronts, snowflakes swirling gently under the yellow glow of streetlights. For 17-year-old Sarah Watson, the night began just like any other holiday outing with friends. She had hurried home after school to dress up for the evening. Sarah, with her soft auburn hair tied back into a messy ponytail and wearing her favorite red scarf, an early Christmas gift from her mom, felt a bubbling excitement. She looked forward to spending time with her close friends at the local movie theater, a popular spot for teens in their small town. The theater was modest in size but radiated an old-world charm with its vintage marquee lights and posters of holiday classics. Families, teenagers, and couples filled the lobby, all eager to share the seasonal spirit. For Sarah and her friends, that was the perfect opportunity to grab popcorn, laugh over small talk, and indulge in the joy of being young. As the group giggled their way through the movie, a holiday comedy that left them in fits of laughter, there was a sense of carefree joy that hung in the air. Sarah felt light, her worries momentarily brushed aside by the magic of the holiday season. Each of her friends had elaborate plans for Christmas, and as they shared their excited gossip, none of them could have guessed just how fragile such moments of happiness could be. The clock read just past 9 p.m. when the film ended. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah and her friends lingered near the theater doors, reluctant to say goodbye. Outside, the world was colder now, with only a few passers-by and the crunching snow under their boots breaking the silence of the night. The streets, once busy with shoppers and festivities, were tranquil. The shimmering Christmas lights, now covered in frost, cast dancing shadows on the sidewalks. "Alright you guys, I'd better head home before my mom starts freaking out," Sarah joked, her breath visible in the icy air. Her friends laughed, and one of them teased, "Don't take the shortcut through the field, it gives me the creeps." Sarah rolled her eyes with a grin, brushing off the comment. That shortcut had always been her go-to path whenever she was eager to shave a few minutes off her walk. After some hugs and the usual exchange of, "Text me when you get home," Sarah waved goodbye and set off alone into the icy glow of the winter night. The wind had picked up by now, and she pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as she walked down Windsor's main street. Strolling beneath rows of festive lights that blinked cheerfully above her, Sarah couldn't help but hum softly along to the Christmas carol playing faintly from a nearby store. As she approached the edge of the downtown district, the neighborhood grew quieter. It was the kind of quiet that was beautiful, yet haunting, where you could hear the crunch of your footsteps and see your long shadow trailing behind in the soft reflections of the streetlights. Sarah glanced at her watch. It was already getting late, and the walk home wasn't far. A few more turns, and she'd reach the intersection that led to the shortcut, a narrow pathway through an open field bordered by clusters of trees. That shortcut had always been her secret weapon to get home faster, despite its eerie reputation. Most of her friends avoided it after dark. "Too creepy," they'd say. But Sarah, independent and strong-willed, never saw the harm. It was a familiar route, one she had walked dozens of times, and she knew every twist and turn like the back of her hand. Still, as she reached the mouth of the overgrown path, she paused for just a moment. The field stretched before her in shadowy silence, and the dim light of a distant lamppost barely broke through the outline of bare trees. Sarah caught herself hesitating, a rarity for her. Shaking off a vague sense of unease, she tightened her grip on her bag and stepped onto the path, her boots crunching softly against the frozen grass. "I'll be home in 5 minutes," she whispered under her breath, as if reassuring herself. The shortcut seemed quieter than usual, with the trees above swaying gently in the icy breeze. Every sound, from the rustle of branches to the faint crackle of frost, felt amplified in the winter stillness. Sarah kept walking. The field was about halfway through when she thought she heard something, a faint noise, possibly a movement, but she quickly brushed it off as her imagination. A fox? Maybe the wind? She didn't bother to look back. Minutes later, only the distant hum of passing cars accompanied her as she neared the edge of the field. She could see the faint lights of her neighborhood blinking just beyond the tree line. A wave of relief washed over her, knowing she was so close to home. And then, the lights went out. Sarah, the spirited and talented girl. Sarah Watson was the kind of girl everyone seemed to notice, not for any flashy antics or loud demeanor but for her natural ability to light up a room with her mere presence. At 17 she radiated a captivating energy that blended warmth, confidence, and an irresistible spark of joy. She wasn't the most popular girl in school, nor did she care to be. But in her quiet, unassuming way, she had a talent for making people feel seen, understood, and appreciated. That perhaps was her truest gift. Born on a snowy December morning in 1988, Sarah grew up in the picturesque town of Windsor, known for its tight-knit community, scenic winters, and modest charm. She lived with her mom, Emily Watson, a local school teacher who raised Sarah single-handedly after her father left when she was still a toddler. Despite their small family, their home was always filled with laughter, love, and the tantalizing aroma of Emily's home-cooked meals. While material possessions were scarce, Sarah had never felt poor. To her, the richness of her life was measured in experiences, the strong bond of family, and the endless curiosity she had for the world around her. At school, Sarah was a standout in more ways than one. Academically, she excelled in nearly every subject, earning a reputation as one of the brightest students in her class. Teachers often remarked how Sarah wasn't just intelligent, she was deeply curious. Whether she was engaging in an intense debate about literature, or raising her hand during a biology lesson with yet another thoughtful question, Sarah's thirst for knowledge was insatiable. She had a knack for seeing things differently, looking at problems from angles most people would overlook. But academics weren't her only talent. Sarah was also a gifted artist, her imagination flowing freely through the delicate strokes of her pencil and brushes. Her sketchbook was a treasure trove of detailed illustrations, everything from tranquil landscapes and expressive portraits to fantastical creatures that looked like they leaped straight from the pages of a fairy tale. Art was her escape, her way of making sense of the world, and everyone who saw her work agreed that she had a rare, extraordinary gift. On weekends, you could often find Sarah at the local community gym, practicing with her track and field team. Although small in stature, she was quick, agile, and incredibly focused. Running gave her a kind of freedom she couldn't find anywhere else, a way to channel her energy and feel utterly unstoppable. It wasn't just about competing for her, running was a release, a space for her to clear her mind and push her limits. There was also her love for music. Sarah had taught herself to play the guitar during one particularly snowy winter when heavy storms kept her homebound. A battered acoustic guitar she discovered in the attic became her constant companion. Her friends loved to tease her about the hours she spent strumming away, crafting new melodies, or performing covers of her favorite indie songs. Music, much like art and running, was another way she expressed herself, a window into the beautiful, vibrant chaos of her mind. But what truly set Sarah apart was her unshakable kindness. In a world that sometimes felt cold and indifferent, Sarah stood as an undeniable force of warmth and compassion. Whether it was helping a classmate study for a challenging test, listening intently as a friend vented about their latest heartbreak, or volunteering at the local animal shelter on weekends, Sarah was always there for the people and the causes she cared about. She had the ability to make everyone she met feel valued, no matter who they were or where they came from. Her friends often joked that she was the glue that held their group together. She was the one who planned impromptu summer picnics, organized midnight movie marathons, and made sure nobody felt left out during the chaos of high school life. More than once, she'd been the peacemaker when tempers flared between friends. Sarah has the patience of a saint, her best friend Megan had once declared. Seriously, she could turn arguing toddlers into a harmonious choir. Yet, like all teenagers, Sarah wasn't perfect. Beneath her confident exterior there were insecurities she kept hidden. She often worried about the future, about whether she'd be able to chase her dreams of becoming an artist, and whether she'd make her mom proud. She was fiercely independent but carried a fear of letting people down, especially those she loved. She also had a stubborn streak, one that showed itself whenever someone tried to impose their will on her. Sarah had always danced to the beat of her own drum, and she wasn't one to back down just because something scared her. As Christmas approached that year, Sarah was in particularly high spirits. She adored the holiday season, the lights, the laughter, the feeling of community. She and her mom had decorated their modest home with sparkling ornaments and freshly baked gingerbread cookies. Their tree, though small, was bursting with charm, each ornament hand-picked or crafted over the years. For Sarah, Christmas wasn't about expensive gifts or grand gestures. It was about the little, meaningful traditions that made the season feel so magical. That evening, Sarah had been especially excited to go out with her friends to the movie theater. They had planned it for weeks, deciding on one of their favorite Christmas comedies. For her, it wasn't just about the movie. It was about laughing until her stomach hurt, sharing popcorn with her best friends, and stepping into the warm, festive glow of Windshire's bustling streets. It was a welcome break from the looming stress of school, and an opportunity to savor the fleeting moments of youth. No one could have predicted how that night would unfold. Sarah, with her bright eyes, hopeful smile, and boundless potential, had always been the kind of person who seemed destined for greatness. But as the last breath of daylight faded into the icy darkness that evening, the world outside seemed a little quieter, a little colder. And somewhere along her journey home, the unimaginable happened. The journey home. A risky choice. It was just past 9:30 p.m. when Sarah stepped out into the frigid December night. The movie had ended not long ago, and the theater's warm, bustling atmosphere had given way to the cold, quiet streets of Windsor. The holiday cheer that covered the town like a shimmering blanket during the day now seemed muted. The once vibrant streets were empty, save for a few lonely cars rolling by, and the faint sound of a distant wind brushing through the trees. Sarah had always loved this time of night. The stillness, the soft crunch of snow beneath her boots, and the way her breath turned into visible clouds that drifted upward. Tonight, her spirits were still high from the evening spent laughing with her friends. She felt at ease, the festive glow of Christmas lights lining the streets keeping her company as she began her walk home. Her usual route home wasn't far, but the winter air was biting, and she was eager to get back to the warm glow of her house. As she approached the intersection near Ridgefield Road, she was met with a choice she had made countless times before: stick to the well-lit main streets, or take the narrow shortcut that cut through an open field and saved her nearly 10 minutes. It was a decision she hardly ever thought twice about. The shortcut was something of a local legend. Most avoided it after dark because of its eerie atmosphere, but Sarah never gave in to those fears. It wasn't like it was an entirely remote area, it was just quieter, darker, with the field bordered by clusters of bare trees that swayed ominously in the wind. That night was no different. Sarah glanced briefly down the lit, empty streets stretching to her left, and then turned her gaze toward the mouth of the shortcut. The air around the field hung heavy and still, the kind of quiet that always made her wonder if the world held its breath when no one was watching. A solitary street lamp stood at the end of the shortcut, but did little to illuminate the path. It felt like a tunnel of shadows, with the trees arching over the field like watchful sentinels. "It's just a field," Sarah mumbled to herself as she tightened her scarf around her neck and adjusted her bag over her shoulder. It was a shortcut she'd used for years, a well-trodden path she knew as well as the inside of her own home. Why would tonight be any different? The first few steps onto the path felt ordinary, her boots crunching against the icy blades of grass beneath. Snowflakes flitted lazily down around her, catching the faint light from the street lamp behind her. She shoved her hands deep into her coat pockets, keeping her chin tucked low as the cold air nipped at her cheeks. The field stretched out before her in shadows and muted tones, with the tree line just close enough for her to pick out the jagged silhouettes of the branches. Her breath hung in the air, dissipating when she moved forward. As she ventured further, the world seemed to grow quieter. The hum of the town and the distant chatter of holiday festivities became muted, replaced by nature's subtle, haunting symphony. There was the soft rustle of wind brushing against the trees, the faint crackle of frost beneath her boots, and the distant hoot of an owl somewhere in the woods. Without realizing it, Sarah found herself walking more briskly, as if her body were trying to pull her faster through the field. Halfway across the field, she noticed how empty the world suddenly felt. Even the rustling wind seemed to hush, as if the field were holding its breath. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, but all that met her gaze was the same quiet stretch of frozen ground and shadows she had already passed. She shook her head quickly, brushing off the faint tendrils of unease creeping into her mind. "It's just the cold messing with me," she whispered under her breath, the sound of her own voice grounding her. She'd always been fearless when it came to this shortcut, often laughing at her friends who claimed it was creepy. Tonight, though, something about the darkness felt different. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it loomed over her, clinging faintly to the edges of her senses. That's when she heard it. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of her boots crunching against frost, but it froze her in her tracks. A noise, sharp, deliberate, and out of place. It could have been a shuffle of feet, or the soft snap of a branch giving way under weight, but it wasn't hers. Sarah stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She stood still, straining her ears against the silence for any sign that she wasn't alone. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of her own heart picking up speed in her chest. Then it came again. This time it sounded closer, not close enough for her to see anything, but enough to send a pulse of unease racing through her body. "Foxes," she muttered, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread curling in her stomach. Or maybe the wind. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she forced her feet to move again, this time quicker than before. She didn't want to seem paranoid, but she hadn't realized just how oppressive the dark could feel. The light at the end of the field grew bigger now, signaling the end of the shortcut. She could see the houses of her neighborhood in the distance, their soft golden hues blinking like tiny beacons of safety. She felt relief flood through her as she stepped faster, eager to close the final distance. The strange noises and the creeping unease were just in her imagination, she told herself. Then, directly behind her, she heard the crunch of footsteps. Her body stiffened, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She turned quickly, her eyes darting into the shadows. "Hello?" she called out, her voice stronger than she expected, but the only response was silence. There was nothing there. Sarah squeezed her bag strap tighter, her heart pounding now as she turned and practically jogged toward the end of the field. The houses were close, so close she could almost hear the lull of their Christmas music through the walls. She reached the edge of the field, a deep sense of relief washing over her as she finally stepped under the faint yellow glow of the last street lamp. But just as quickly, that relief vanished. With a sharp flicker, the light above her went out. The family's worry, and the call to the police. By the time the clock struck 11 p.m., the Watson household was unusually still, save for the faint ticking of the old wall clock hanging in the living room. Emily Watson paced the length of the room, her bare feet brushing rhythmically against the worn-out carpet. In between hurried glances at the front door, she clenched and unclenched her hands, a nervous habit she developed when Sarah was little, usually when she waited for school buses to arrive on stormy mornings. Tonight, however, this unease carried a different, sharper edge. One Emily couldn't shake no matter how tightly she crossed her arms across her chest. She should have been home by now, Emily whispered to herself, shooting a glance at the glowing clock on the microwave in the kitchen. Sarah had sent her a text earlier in the evening before the movie started, promising to be home no later than 9:30. In all of her 17 years, Sarah had never been the type to stay out late without calling or at least sending a message. She was responsible, considerate, almost to a fault, and always made sure her mom knew where she was. At first, Emily told herself not to worry. Maybe Sarah had stopped to chat with her friends. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she just got caught up in the sparkling holiday atmosphere of Winshire's decorated streets. Teenagers lose track of time, Emily muttered aloud, trying and failing to convince herself that the reasons for Sarah's delay were harmless. But deep down, a small voice of doubt gnawed at the edge of her mind, whispering all the worst-case scenarios she didn't want to imagine. By 11:30 p.m., the growing tension became unbearable. Emily picked up her phone again, for what felt like the 100th time, and dialed Sarah's number. She pressed the phone to her ear, the digital ring echoing in her ears as she stared out the frost-framed window, hoping to see the familiar silhouette of her daughter walking toward the house, but the call went straight to voicemail. "Hi, this is Sarah. I'm probably busy drawing, playing, or running around somewhere, but leave a message. Unless you're Mom, in which case, yes, I will clean my room, that—" Emily didn't bother to let the voicemail finish before pressing the red button to end the call. The playful cheeriness of Sarah's recorded voice, which normally made Emily smile, now felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She'd answer if she could, Emily murmured under her breath. Her instincts told her something wasn't right, that this wasn't just a case of a teenager forgetting to check in. Sarah was out there, somewhere, and whatever was keeping her from coming home couldn't be good. Anxiety began to twist itself into dread, swirling in the pit of her stomach as she considered what to do next. She paced to the front door, rubbing her hands together nervously before unlocking it and stepping out onto the icy porch. The cold bit at her skin, but it wasn't the chill that made her shiver. It was the heavy weight of the unknown. "Sarah!" she called out into the stillness of the night, her voice trembling slightly. Her breath, clouded and ephemeral in the frosty air, disappeared almost as quickly as the echo of her call. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the glimmering Christmas lights on nearby houses doing little to break the suffocating emptiness. Emily waited, straining her ears, hoping to hear the familiar crunch of boots on snow or a faint, "Mom, I'm here!" But there was nothing, just the cold wind rustling through the bare branches of the maple tree standing sentinel at the edge of their yard. By midnight, Emily sat hunched over the kitchen table, her head buried in her hands. The pacing had stopped, but the storm of worry inside her grew stronger with every passing minute. She grabbed her phone, scrolling through her contact list, until she found the number for Megan, Sarah's best friend. The phone rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Mrs. Watson?" Megan's tone was unsure, her voice heavy with sleep. "Megan, sweetie," Emily began, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry to call this late, but have you heard from Sarah? Did she decide to stay at someone's house after the movie? Maybe her phone died and—" "No, Mrs. Watson," Megan interrupted quickly, now sounding very awake. "We all left the theater together. Sarah said she was headed home. She took her shortcut through the field like she always does. Isn't she home?" Emily felt her heart sink. The shortcut. The one she had always told Sarah to avoid, especially at night. The path cut through the empty field at the edge of town, a narrow stretch that saved time but was far from reassuring in the dark. There were no houses lining the path, no lights except for a single dim street lamp, and the surrounding trees cast long, sprawling shadows across it. Sarah had always insisted it was perfectly safe, brushing off Emily's concerns with her trademark confidence. But now, as Megan's words sank in, Emily felt her stomach twist painfully. "Thank you, Megan," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll call you if I hear anything." When she hung up, she didn't wait another second. Grabbing her coat and car keys, she rushed out the door into the freezing night. The drive to the field was a blur, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they turned white. She parked at the edge of the path, her headlights washing over the snow-covered ground and casting eerie shadows into the field. "Sarah!" she called out again, her voice echoing into the cold, empty darkness. When there was no response, not even the faintest sound, Emily felt her legs give out, and she sank to her knees in the snow. Tears stung her eyes, but she forced herself to push through the horror creeping into her mind. She had to focus, she had to think. By 1 a.m., with no sign of Sarah and no clue as to where she could be, Emily made the decision she had been dreading all night. She picked up her phone and dialed the local police station. The officer's voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, and understanding. "Winshire Police Department, Officer Davis speaking." Hello," Emily stammered, clutching the phone to her ear. My daughter Sarah hasn't come home. She should have been home hours ago, and I've called, I've searched. She's not answering her phone. I think something's happened. Please, I need help." The officer asked a few questions, her age, her appearance, the circumstances of her disappearance, while Emily answered as best she could through her rising panic. Within minutes, the dispatcher had assured her that officers would be sent to begin a search. And so began the longest night of Emily Watson's life, as the dark and quiet town of Winshire became the epicenter of a frantic search for a girl who had simply been walking home. A massive search effort. By the time the sun began to rise over Winshire on the morning of December 16th, the quiet little town had transformed into the epicenter of a frantic and ever-expanding search effort. Word of Sarah Watson's disappearance had spread quickly overnight, leaving many in this close-knit community shaken and eager to help. It wasn't just the fact that Sarah had vanished, it was how sudden and inexplicable it seemed. One moment a cheerful 17-year-old was walking home through a familiar path, and the next, she had simply disappeared into the cold, December night. The early hours of the search began with just a small team, local police officers, bundled up against the freezing morning air, alongside Emily Watson, who was no longer able to contain her tears. The lead investigator, Officer Davis, an experienced but soft-spoken man known for his dedication to missing persons cases, moved quickly to establish a base of operations. Using the community center in the heart of Winshire, the police set up tables, maps, and a whiteboard scrawled hastily with notes and checklists. Emily, sitting pale and exhausted at the corner of the room, answered every question they posed. What was Sarah wearing when she left the theater? Her red scarf, the one I gave her last week. A black coat. She had her favorite bag, brown leather with a little sunflower charm on the zipper. When was the last time you saw her? Before she left for the movies. I told her to be careful, but she always laughed when I brought up that path. She thought I was worrying too much. Emily's voice cracked and she buried her face in her hands. As the morning wore on, more people joined the search. Neighbors, family friends, even teenagers Sarah went to high school with volunteered to help comb through every corner of the town. Flyers with Sarah's smiling face were being printed and distributed at lightning speed, stapled to telephone poles, taped up in store windows, and passed out by hand to everyone in town. Beneath her picture, bold letters read, "Missing, Sarah Watson," followed by a physical description and the last place she'd been seen. For those who had known Sarah, the spunky artist who'd stopped to pet every dog on her street, the bright-eyed girl who greeted everyone with a warm smile, the sight of her face on a missing persons flyer was a punch to the gut. The search started at the field, the shortcut path Sarah had taken so many times before. Officers used sticks to comb through the frozen ground, brushing aside loose snow in search of something, anything, that might offer a clue. They found only faint boot prints, half obscured by the night's snowfall, leading partway across the field before disappearing into the icy expanse. The snow around the area was undisturbed, as if the world itself had erased any signs of Sarah's footsteps. "She knows this way like the back of her hand," Emily told Officer Davis, as they stood at the edge of the field. "Something must have stopped her. Or someone." Sniffer dogs were brought in shortly after noon. The shepherds, noses down and tails rigid, bounded eagerly through the frozen grass and frost-crusted trees, following Sarah's scent trail from the point where she entered the shortcut. Their handlers scanned the field with sharp eyes, watching for any movement, any reaction that might signal a discovery. Emily held her breath from where she stood at the perimeter, her arms clasped tightly as tears streamed silently down her cheeks, but the dogs found no clear answers, only leading scents that ended abruptly, somewhere along the shadowy tree line. By mid-afternoon, the search effort expanded drastically. Police officers called in nearby departments for assistance, and the mayor of Winshire, whose own son had once gone to school with Sarah, approved the use of additional resources. Within hours, police drones began hovering over snow-blanketed fields and wooded areas, their cameras scanning the landscape for any sign of movement or disturbance. A helicopter joined the operation, its spotlight flashing across rooftops and through stretches of dense forest in an ever-widening radius. The whir of its blades echoed over homes and businesses, rattling windows with its urgency. Groups of citizens formed search parties, moving in rows across the outskirts of town, lanterns and flashlights bouncing in the dimming afternoon light. Winshire seemed to collectively hold its breath as people knocked on every door, asking neighbors if they'd seen anything strange the previous night. Many residents hadn't noticed anything amiss. Just the same still, frigid quiet they always experienced on a winter's evening. A few mentioned hearing footsteps or voices faintly carried by the wind, but no one could say for sure where they'd come from, nor what they'd meant. Megan, Sarah's best friend, showed up to help as well, though the guilt in her eyes was impossible to miss. Emily pulled her into a tight embrace as soon as she arrived, reassuring her in a shaky voice. "It's not your fault," but Megan couldn't stop repeating through tears. "I should have walked with her, I should have stayed just a little longer." As darkness fell once again over Winshire, the determination of the search teams only grew. Large floodlights were mounted at the base of the field and other key areas. The pathway Sarah had taken, once bathed in eerie shadows, was now lit up as brightly as a stadium. Searchers combed through every inch of it again, this time moving slower, digging deeper into the frost and leaves, hoping to uncover something they'd missed before. Town residents brought pots of steaming coffee and sandwiches to volunteers working late into the night as temperatures dipped even further. The community was united, joined by hope and by fear. Parents held their children closer, whispering quiet prayers that Sarah would be found soon, and that their own kids would always make it home safely after every journey. By the early hours of the morning, exhaustion began to settle in, even for the most determined searchers. Emily sat slumped in a folding chair at the community center, her face pale and her lips trembling. The clock ticked, the minutes dragging forward with excruciating slowness. Every sound, every shuffle of feet, every creak of a door opening, made her head snap up, hoping for news. But there was none. And so, as the second night fell over Winshire, the terrifying reality was sinking in. Sarah was still missing, and the clues that might lead to her return seemed non-existent. Every passing moment felt like a further step away from hope, yet no one was ready to give up. Not yet. Following a fragile trail of clues. In the days following Sarah Watson's disappearance, Winshire police found themselves unraveling a puzzle with almost no pieces to work with. For 2 long, excruciating days, search teams methodically combed through the town and surrounding areas, chasing false leads that eventually fizzled out. The field she had walked through bore no evidence beyond faint, partially obscured boot prints. The deeper they looked, the more maddening the silence became. On the morning of December 18th, Detective Laura Hines leaned over her desk in the impromptu command post set up at the Winshire Community Center. The map of the town was spread out before her, cluttered with notes and pushpins marking every failed line of inquiry. Laura massaged her temples with one hand, while the other hovered over her untouched mug of coffee. Her jaw clenched as she mentally replayed the events leading up to Sarah's disappearance. "We're missing something," she murmured, half to herself, half to Officer Davis, who was sifting through witness statements nearby. "Or maybe we haven't found the right thing yet," Davis replied, flipping through the reports with a mix of determination and fatigue. "Someone had to see her, someone had to notice something." The break came when Rebecca Holt, a longtime resident whose home overlooked the northern edge of the shortcut field, walked into the station that morning. Her expression was uncertain as she clutched the strap of her handbag, hesitant but clearly propelled by a sense of duty. Rebecca sat nervously across from Hines, her voice a little shaky as she shared what she remembered from the night Sarah disappeared. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Rebecca admitted, pushing a strand of graying hair behind her ear. "But there was this man, standing near the edge of the trees just before night fell. It was strange because he wasn't moving, just standing there, near the path Sarah always takes." This instantly caught Hines's attention. "Can you describe him? Anything you remember? Clothes, height, even the way he stood could help?" She leaned forward in her chair, pen poised over her notepad like it was the lifeline she needed. Rebecca frowned, squinting slightly as if trying to project the image into her mind. "I'd say he was average height, maybe mid-30s or 40s. He had a dark jacket, I'm sure of that. And he was wearing one of those baseball caps, but I couldn't make out much more. He kept looking down the road like he was waiting for someone." Her voice wavered as she finished, nervously chewing her lip. "I thought it could have been a neighbor, but it didn't feel right, you know? He wasn't familiar at all." Hines exchanged a look with Davis. This was the first significant lead they'd been waiting for. "Thank you, Rebecca, this is very helpful," Hines assured her, scribbling down notes rapidly. "If you think of anything else at all, even something small, don't hesitate to call." "I'll try," Rebecca replied faintly, her hands stiff with worry. "I just hope you find her." With that she left, leaving Hines and Davis in tense silence, their minds already piecing together Rebecca's account with other scraps of incomplete information. It didn't take long for Davis to link Rebecca's description to another witness report. A gas station attendant located near the movie theater had previously mentioned an odd guy matching Rebecca's description who had loitered near the parking lot that same evening. "You know, he wasn't doing anything, but that's exactly what was weird about it," the attendant added when questioned further by detectives. "He was just standing there, staring at the cars. It's like he wasn't where he was supposed to be, and then he bailed really quick when I looked at him too long." For the first time, investigators began to entertain an unsettling possibility. Sarah might not have just disappeared. She might have been followed. As police pursued this new line of inquiry, forensic teams returned to the shortcut field, combing its edges with renewed effort. At first it felt like a repeat of their earlier searches. The ground was frozen solid. Every leaf, every branch dusted delicately in frost, seemed untouched by anything or anyone. But then, tucked in the tangled underbrush lining the east side of the path, one officer spotted something small but undeniably out of place, a piece of bright red fabric. The fragment was barely an inch wide, its color striking against the muted whites and browns of the winter landscape. It had caught on the lower branches of a thorny bush, ripped on its way through. The officer crouched down, carefully bagging it as evidence, his breath visible in the icy air as he spoke into his radio. "I think we've got something. Red fabric snagged here. This could match the scarf the mother described." When word of the discovery reached Emily Watson back at the station, she froze mid-step. "Red!" she whispered, her voice trembling as her face paled. "Her scarf!" Officer Davis knelt beside her, speaking as gently as possible. "We can't be certain yet, Mrs. Watson, but it's a strong possibility. We're sending it for testing to see if it matches the material description from her scarf." Emily nodded silently, her tear-streaked cheeks trembling as she sat back down. It was hardly the comfort she wanted, but it was something to anchor her hope, even as dread churned in her chest. Forensics determined within hours that the fabric did match Sarah's scarf. On closer examination, tiny particles of dirt and unidentified fibers were embedded in the torn edge. These weren't consistent with the field's natural terrain, suggesting the fabric had been dragged across a surface, possibly concrete or wood. It was a revelation that shifted the trajectory of the investigation. "It could mean she was taken from the field," Hines said matter-of-factly while briefing her team. "We need to broaden the search to properties or structures nearby, abandoned sheds, barns, any buildings in poor condition, anywhere someone could have hidden her." It was backbreaking work. Officers and volunteers combed through frozen barns, decaying tool sheds, and rusted trailers on the outskirts of town. Every creak of wood, every unexplained noise deepened the eerie tension surrounding each site. Local residents lent hand-drawn maps of rarely traversed trails and forgotten hunting cabins deep in the woods, ensuring every corner of Winshire was scrutinized. While the search expanded to physical locations, another potential break surfaced. A man from a neighboring town reported seeing someone suspicious lingering near a rest stop just 2 nights after Sarah disappeared. "He drove an old truck, looked beat up, both the guy and the truck," he told police with a nervous chuckle. "What I remember most, he wore a baseball cap just like you described." The man provided a partial license plate number, prompting investigators to zero in on the region's registry database to track its owner. Finally, after days of silence and scattered clues, a chilling picture was beginning to form. Sarah hadn't gotten lost. Someone had taken her, and that someone had left behind faint traces: a torn scarf, footprints unfinished in the snow, a suspicious man lurking in the shadows. The fragile trail of evidence carried both dread and determination. Time was slipping through the cracks, but with every step closer to the truth, there was still hope left to cling to. The discovery of the body. A heartbreaking truth. It was December 29th, exactly 2 weeks since Sarah Watson had vanished without a trace, when investigators finally stumbled upon the answer Emily Watson had both prayed for and dreaded. The previous few days had been a whirlwind of activity, with police widening their search far beyond the borders of Winshire. Abandoned barns, derelict houses, and dense wooded areas miles outside the town's limits were being methodically investigated. Despite the frantic pace and endless hours logged by officers, volunteers, and forensic teams alike, the trail felt agonizingly cold. Each passing day seemed to pull Sarah further out of reach, and though search parties refused to give up, the collective hope gripping the town began to waver. Detective Laura Hines, however, refused to stop. She knew from experience that cases like this did not resolve themselves cleanly or quickly. It usually came down to following every excruciating clue, every small inconsistency that others might overlook. To her, the vague sightings of the man in the baseball cap and the discovery of the broken red scarf weren't just fragments of evidence, they were pieces of a dark narrative that had yet to fully unfold. Somewhere out there was the answer, and she'd find it. On the morning of December 29th, a break came. A patrol unit searching the outskirts of Winshire received a tip from a local hunter who frequented a secluded stretch of forest north of the town. He'd come across a forgotten hunting cabin, its door padlocked but its surrounding area littered with discarded trash, much of it disturbing: empty food wrappers, a length of rope, and a stained tarp partially concealed with snow. "Didn't sit right with me," the hunter told officers when he reported it. "Figured it wasn't the kind of mess an animal would leave." Detective Hines arrived on site within the hour, immediately struck by the eerie quiet that enveloped the frozen woods. The hunting cabin stood amidst the barren, snow-draped trees like a relic from another time, its wood warped and darkened with age. Everything about it screamed neglect. To Hines it had a certain sinister weight, as though the structure itself had absorbed years of human desperation and misery. The officers at the scene worked carefully to cut the rusted chain securing the door, their breath visible in the sharp winter air. Emily Watson had been notified of the lead, but Hines had purposefully asked her to stay at the station. This was no place for a grieving mother. As the lock gave way with a loud snap, Hines's heart raced with a mix of dread and anticipation. She wasn't sure what they would find inside, but the cabin already reeked of trouble. The musty stench that wafted from the cabin's interior confirmed her worst fears. Inside, the air was heavy with decay, a suffocating blend of damp wood, rotting debris, and the sickly, unmistakable scent of death. Hines's flashlight swept across the dimly lit room, revealing broken furniture, piles of trash, and dark stains marring the floorboards. And then, against the far wall, they saw her. Sarah Watson's body lay partially obscured by an old, tattered blanket, her form unnaturally still in the pale light filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Detective Hines froze, her breath hitching as the weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. For a fleeting second she held onto the tiniest sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, Sarah might still be alive. But as she moved closer, the truth became heartbreakingly clear. Sarah was gone. The red scarf Emily had described was still loosely wrapped around her neck, now faded and frayed. Her once bright cheeks were pale, her auburn hair matted and tangled against the floor. Hines felt her chest tighten as she knelt beside the girl, the harsh reality as cold and unforgiving as the winter air outside. For all her youthful spirit, her vibrant light, Sarah had been extinguished. "Call the forensic team," Hines instructed quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "Seal the area. We'll need to photograph and catalog everything before we move her." Her colleagues around her nodded in solemn acknowledgement, their faces etched with sorrow. Even the most experienced officers felt the sting of this discovery. In a small town like Windsor, tragedies like this were never abstract. They were deeply personal. Hours later, back at the station, Hines faced the most difficult task of all, delivering the news to Emily Watson. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the heater in the background as Emily sat at the edge of a chair, her wide, tear-filled eyes fixed on Hines. She didn't speak, didn't even appear to breathe, as the detective walked in and knelt down beside her, clasping Emily's trembling hands. "We found her," Hines said softly, her voice breaking under the weight of her own grief. "I'm so sorry, Emily, I'm so sorry." Emily let out a strangled gasp, her body folding as sobs overcame her. No, not my baby," she choked, clutching her chest as though the pain might shatter her completely. Hines stayed close, offering what little comfort she could as the mother's grief filled the room, profound and unbearable. The autopsy report later confirmed that Sarah had likely been killed the same night she disappeared. She had died from asphyxiation, the bruises on her neck consistent with strangulation by rope. Based on the evidence, police concluded she had been held in the cabin for some time, though how long remained unclear. The isolation of the site had bought the perpetrator time, allowing him to carry out his heinous acts far away from prying eyes. Forensic teams also discovered key pieces of evidence at the scene: strands of coarse fibers matching those found on Sarah's torn scarf, fingerprints on the tarp, and traces of DNA on items recovered from the cabin. It wasn't long before these small but critical discoveries led investigators to a suspect, a man whose shadow had loomed over their investigation from the beginning. But for Emily Watson, no arrest or conviction could erase the pain of losing her daughter. The discovery of Sarah's body marked the end of one chapter of the investigation, but it opened an even darker one. The fight for justice in a case that had shaken Windsor to its core. A town that had once been lit with the warmth of the holiday season now seemed blanketed in grief. Christmas lights still twinkled on houses, but their glow felt hollow, a painful echo of the joy that had been stolen. For Sarah's family, friends, and even those who had only known her in passing, the knowledge of her fate was a wound that would never fully heal. And for Detective Laura Hines, the image of Sarah Watson lying alone in a forgotten cabin would haunt her for the rest of her life. The critical pieces of evidence. In the wake of Sarah Watson's heartbreaking discovery, the focus of the investigation shifted sharply. The search teams had done their job, grim as it was, and now the task of unraveling the dark truth behind her fate fell squarely on the shoulders of the forensic experts, detectives, and the small but relentless Windsor Police Department. Time was crucial, not only to catch the perpetrator but to ensure that no detail, no matter how small, was overlooked. The first, and most emotionally charged piece of evidence was Sarah's red scarf. Discovered earlier at the edge of the field, the vibrant fabric had been a beacon of hope, albeit fleeting. Now, in the sterile light of the crime lab, it became a window into the violent forces Sarah had encountered that night. Forensic scientists delicately examined the scarf under layers of magnification, scanning for fibers, DNA, or anything that didn't belong. What they found was invaluable. Strands of coarse, dark fibers embedded near the frayed edges of the scarf, a detail easily overlooked during the initial field investigation. These fibers, though seemingly insignificant at first glance, carried a unique texture and synthetic composition. The lead forensic analyst, Sarah Grayson, recognized that such material was commonly used in industrial-strength ropes or inexpensive carpeting. "This isn't from her clothing or the field environment," Grayson explained to Detective Laura Hines during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "It's a transfer, something that happened when she was restrained or moved." This finding prompted a reinvestigation of the cabin where Sarah's body had been found. Returning with fresh eyes and the knowledge that such fibers indicated a potential source of confinement, detectives tore apart every corner of the decaying structure. They discovered a section of fraying rope tossed beneath a broken table near the back wall. A quick analysis confirmed it, as the type used for heavy-duty binding, and the material matched the fibers extracted from Sarah's scarf. The rope bore faint traces of Sarah's DNA on its coarse surface, further linking it directly to the crime. Next came the tarp, a grim centerpiece in the chilling tableau left behind at the cabin. Stained and half-concealed in snow around the property, it initially seemed to be nothing more than a dirty remnant of neglect, but a closer look revealed it had played a far more sinister role. Small amounts of blood, invisible to the naked eye but revealed through luminol testing, dotted the tarp's surface. Though microscopic, the blood traces were enough to confirm they belonged to Sarah. What's more, embedded along the edges of the tarp were minute particles of dirt that didn't match the surrounding forest soil. This prompted analysts to widen their geographic focus, concluding that Sarah had likely been transported through another location before being hidden in the cabin. But what led detectives to their most significant breakthrough was, ironically, the fingerprints. The tarnished metal padlock that had secured the door of the cabin during initial discovery turned out to be a treasure trove of evidence. Fingerprint technicians found a partial but clear print on the interior clasp. This was a bold oversight by the perpetrator, as the print matched an individual already in law enforcement databases. The name linked to the print, James Peterson, a shadowy figure, comes into focus. James Peterson had been on the Winshire Police Department's radar once before. In the early 2000s, he had been questioned in connection to a string of attempted abductions in nearby counties, cases that bore an unsettling resemblance to Sarah's. He had never been charged due to lack of sufficient evidence. Peterson worked as a delivery truck driver and frequently traveled through rural areas, claiming his nomadic lifestyle was the result of financial hardship. But detectives now realized that his job afforded him both access to isolated locations and anonymity. Detectives began investigating Peterson's recent activity, scrutinizing his delivery routes, interviewing co-workers, and conducting a thorough background check. Suspiciously, Peterson had taken 3 consecutive sick days during the week Sarah disappeared, despite having no record of illness with his employer. On the day of Sarah's disappearance, his phone's GPS had coincidentally been disabled, an anomaly Peterson later claimed was because his phone's battery had died. But his phone wasn't entirely silent. Cell tower records showed a ping from his device less than 2 miles from the hunting cabin shortly before midnight on the night Sarah vanished. These findings positioned Peterson inexactly but damningly near the scene of her abduction and murder. It was circumstantial, but paired with the forensic evidence, it painted a compelling picture for detectives. The DNA breakthrough. While detectives built a case around Peterson's suspicious movements, the definitive evidence came back from the lab in the form of DNA. Forensic analysts found strands of hair on Sarah's clothes that didn't belong to her. These hairs, coarse and dark, were tested for mitochondrial DNA, revealing a positive match to James Peterson. Not stopping there, investigators analyzed the fingerprints recovered from the tarp and ropes found at the cabin. Both produced identical results, James Peterson's prints. At this point, the evidence was no longer fragile. It was ironclad. The final blow came when detectives discovered a stash of industrial rope, identical to the one used in the crime, in Peterson's garage. Other items recovered from his home, including duct tape and a partially burned set of outdoor clothes, matched descriptions from multiple witness reports of the man seen near the field on the night Sarah disappeared. In Peterson's basement, covered partly by an old drop cloth, they unearthed another chilling detail, a rolled-up map with circled locations, many of which matched areas with reported disappearances of young women over several years. This man wasn't just prepared, Detective Hines later remarked during a press conference. He planned. He chose his moment. A web of connections. The evidence wasn't just physical. Interviews with witnesses began to corroborate the mounting case against Peterson. Gas station attendants, neighbors, and even a co-worker testified to having seen Peterson acting erratically in the days leading up to Sarah's disappearance. One witness recalled seeing him loitering near the movie theater on the evening Sarah was out with her friends. Another described spotting his truck near the field shortcut shortly after 9 p.m. that night. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, microscopic fiber, and digital marker acted as threads in a web pulling James Peterson closer to justice. It was a grim process, painstaking in its details, but it was undeniable. Slowly, the picture of that December night came into focus. Peterson had seen Sarah leave the theater, identified her as a target, and followed her to the shortcut where he abducted her. For the investigators, piecing the puzzle of Sarah's final moments was both a professional triumph and a personal devastation. For Emily Watson, the mother now left with only memories of her vibrant teenage daughter, the mounting evidence meant closure, but it also meant facing the darkest truths about humanity. For Winshire, it was a chilling reminder that even the safest places are not immune to tragedy. The perpetrator revealed. When the name James Peterson surfaced during the investigation, it wasn't entirely new to law enforcement. However, the chilling details about who he was and what investigators uncovered sent shockwaves through the team and the entire town of Winshire. Peterson was a 38-year-old delivery truck driver who lived in a dilapidated home just 3 miles from Emily Watson's. With short, graying hair often hidden beneath his ever-present baseball cap, deep-set eyes, and a wiry frame, he was the kind of man you could pass on the street without thinking twice. For most of Winshire's residents, Peterson was a stranger, quietly blending into the background of their small-town lives. He had few close connections, rarely spoke to neighbors, and seemed to live entirely under the radar. But as detectives pieced together his past, a much darker version of James Peterson began to emerge. Peterson had a criminal history that stretched back over a decade, though much of it had flown under public notice. In 2002, Peterson had been questioned in connection to the reported stalking of 2 young women in a neighboring county, both of whom described feeling like they were being followed during their evening routes home. One victim even recalled seeing a man in a dark coat and a baseball cap lingering near her workplace 2 weeks before she was grabbed and nearly forced into a van. Though Peterson had been a person of interest in the case, the lack of physical evidence made it impossible to convict him, and he was eventually released. These incidents were further corroborated by chilling testimony gathered during the investigation into Sarah's disappearance. A gas station worker in Winshire recalled seeing Peterson loitering on December 15th, the night Sarah went missing. He wasn't buying gas or anything, just standing there smoking and not looking anyone in the eye, the attendant reported. It made my skin crawl, like he was waiting, I think. Further, investigators uncovered that Peterson's occupation as a delivery driver gave him what appeared to be the perfect cover for his predatory behavior. With delivery routes spanning multiple counties and often taking him along rural back roads and isolated locations, Peterson had the freedom and opportunity to prowl unnoticed. Detectives now believed it was no coincidence that these routes frequently coincided with small towns like Winshire, where his movements wouldn't attract suspicion, closing the net. By the time the Winshire Police Department zeroed in on Peterson, the mounting circumstantial evidence against him started to feel overwhelming. Between the eyewitness reports, the GPS data from his truck, and the fingerprints pulled from the cabin padlock, Peterson quickly became the primary suspect in Sarah's abduction and murder. But if detectives wanted to ensure justice, circumstantial evidence wasn't enough. They needed a confession, or additional undeniable proof that he had been at the scene. Detective Laura Hines, fueled by the weighty responsibility to deliver answers to Sarah's grieving mother, pushed the investigation into overdrive. Subpoenas were issued for Peterson's phone records, financial history, and employer timestamps, which ultimately revealed discrepancies that undermined his claims of innocence. For example, a review of his work logs showed that he had fabricated additional delivery stops the night Sarah disappeared. These stops, logged on paper and unverified by actual deliveries, put him near the Forest Edge field, at the exact time Sarah would have been walking home. Detectives also conducted a search of Peterson's home, and what they found strengthened their case. Hidden in a cluttered corner of his detached garage was the smoking gun they needed, a collection of industrial-grade ropes matching the strand used to bind Sarah. Investigators also retrieved an old, partially burned gray jacket stuffed into a trash bag beneath a pile of junk. The jacket, though scorched, bore inconspicuous stains that forensics later confirmed as Sarah's blood. In Peterson's basement, under layers of dust, they discovered another unnerving clue, a folded map of rural routes and trails with certain locations circled in red ink. Winshire was marked prominently. It was clear this man wasn't just an impulsive predator, Hines would later tell reporters. He was deliberate, he kept track, planned ahead, and chose his victims with horrifying care. It wasn't just an act of violence. It was calculated exploitation. The arrest, on January 3, 2006, officers arrived at James Peterson's shabby one-story house. The day was bitterly cold with snow falling steadily, muffling the sound of the cars pulling up to his driveway. Peterson answered the door in a stained flannel shirt and jeans, his weathered face betraying only faint confusion at the sight of police officers on his doorstep. "James Peterson," Detective Hines said as she stepped forward, her eyes locked on him. "You're under arrest for the abduction and murder of Sarah Watson." Her voice was firm, steady, leaving no room for doubt. Peterson froze, his face blank as he looked between the officers, the red and blue lights of their vehicles flashing against the snowy backdrop. "I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, but his hand twitched as if he'd been caught mid-thought, trying to decide if he should run. His options quickly evaporated as officers moved in, pulling his hands behind his back to slap on the cuffs. "This is a mistake!" Peterson growled, his voice gaining a defensive edge. "You've got the wrong guy! I don't know anything about this girl." But as the officers led him to the patrol car, neighbors gathered outside their houses, braving the cold to catch a glimpse of the commotion. The quiet, unsettling man they'd barely noticed for years was now at the center of the town's attention, his name whispered in shocked, horrified tones. Inside investigation rooms. Once in custody, Peterson was placed in an interrogation room, dressed in an orange jumpsuit that reflected the bleak fluorescence of the ceiling light above him. Detective Hines sat across from him with a thin folder containing the evidence against him. She didn't rush the confrontation. Instead, she opened it slowly, piece by piece, revealing items that sealed his fate. Clear photos of the ropes, the fingerprints, the jacket, and, most damning, the padlock from the cabin. "You followed her that night, didn't you?" Hines asked, her voice calm but unyielding. "You waited until the streets were quiet, saw her head toward the field, and you made your move." Peterson remained silent, staring at the table, his jaw twitching. "You've been careful before," Hines continued, leaning forward. "I'll give you that, but people slip up eventually. They get sloppy, and you, James, left us everything we needed to find you. The rope, the fingerprints, even your burned-out jacket. You didn't think we'd piece it all together?" Peterson's lips tightened, his knuckles whitening as his hands clenched the table's edge, but he refused to speak. For hours, Hines pushed relentlessly, laying out the evidence in excruciating detail. It wasn't until she placed a photo of Sarah, the bright-eyed, hopeful girl whose life had been brutally stolen, in front of him that something shifted. Peterson's stare wavered, his breath hitching slightly. "You took everything from her," Hines said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You can't undo that, but you can tell us why." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Peterson broke his silence. His voice was a quiet, trembling murmur that grew louder as he spilled the horrifying truth. "She fought back," he admitted, hands shaking uncontrollably. "I didn't mean for it to go that far, but she wouldn't stop screaming." His confession unraveled the sequence of events. How he followed Sarah, lured her off the path, and panicked when she resisted. It was a moment of clarity for the investigation, but an unspeakable tragedy for all who loved Sarah Watson. Peterson's admission brought a heavy, painful closure, a confirmation of what they already feared. For the town of Windsor, James Peterson's arrest marked the end of weeks of anguish, but also left behind a permanent scar. The quiet streets, once joyous with holiday cheer, now carried an unshakable weight, a constant reminder of the evil that had hidden amongst them. And for Emily Watson, Sarah's heartbroken mother, no punishment for Peterson would ever be enough to fill the void her daughter left behind. The confession and motive. Sitting in the stark interrogation room, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly, James Peterson looked smaller than life. The wiry man with his pale complexion and unkempt hair had none of the imposing presence you might expect from someone capable of such horrific violence. But as Detective Laura Hines sat across from him, she saw something else. A darkness that radiated not from his stature but from his demeanor. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the cold steel table, and he seemed to shrink under the weight of the evidence laid out in front of him. It would take hours, but eventually the truth would pour out. A confession that painted a haunting picture of what had happened to Sarah Watson. The breaking point Detective Hines had been trained to read people, every flicker of an eye, every twitch of a muscle, every moment of hesitation. Peterson had been quiet since his arrest, denying everything with feigned excuses and vague protests. "This is a mistake," he'd muttered when the cuffs went on, but Hines knew that among the mountains of evidence stacked against him, the real key to locking him away forever was his voice, his admission. "You can keep sitting there, James," Hines began, her tone calm but deliberate. "Keep pretending this is going to go away, but it won't, because here's the truth. We know you were there that night. We know you followed Sarah Watson when she left the theater. We know you waited in the shadows, watching her." She leaned forward, the folder of evidence open on the table between them. "And we know that poor girl didn't make it home because of you." Peterson's jaw twitched slightly, his eyes darting between the table and the detective, but he didn't speak. "James," Hines continued, her voice softening just a bit. "This doesn't have to get uglier than it already is. I want to know why. That's it. Why Sarah? Why that night? You wanted control, didn't you? Or maybe you were scared. Maybe things got out of hand." Peterson finally sighed, his shoulders sagging under invisible weight. After what felt like an eternity of silence, he spoke, his voice low and shaky. She wasn't supposed to fight back," he whispered, his words more to himself than to Hines, his hands curled into fists. It wasn't supposed to go like that." Hines latched onto the opening, leaning in further. "What wasn't supposed to happen, James? Did you panic? Did you lose control?" Peterson nodded almost imperceptibly, his face pale and clouded with what might have been remorse or fear. "She screamed," he said, his voice cracking. "She wouldn't stop screaming." The night in question. Slowly the sequence of events began to unravel as Peterson released his grip on the truth. "I saw her at the theater," he began, his voice barely audible. "She was laughing with her friends, happy, carefree, like she didn't have a worry in the world, and I just knew." "Knew what?" Hines pressed. "That—" His voice faltered, and for a moment he stared at the table, his gaze hollow. "That she was the one I'd been looking for." Hines felt the coldness of his words settle over the room like a shadow. "What do you mean, the one?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pit forming in her stomach. Peterson took a breath, his hand moving up to fidget with his collar. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered, but under Hines's unyielding gaze, he continued. "She reminded me of someone I lost a long time ago, someone I couldn't protect." "Protect?" Hines repeated skeptically. "Is that what you were doing, James? Protecting her by attacking her, by taking her?" Peterson's face twisted into a pained expression, but there was something else lurking beneath his words, a sickening justification for his actions. "Do you know what it's like," he said after a moment, his voice sharper now, "to feel like you've lost everything? To feel so invisible that no one notices whether you exist?" He banged the table lightly with his fist. "She noticed." "Sarah noticed you?" Hines asked, frowning. "How?" "She looked at me!" Peterson cried suddenly, his voice rising. "When I was standing across the street from the theater, just for a second, but she saw me. Not like the way everyone else looks through me all the time. She saw me." Hines let the silence linger before speaking again, her voice calm and cutting. "So you followed her. Is that what happened, James? You were so desperate to be noticed that you followed a young girl through the night?" Peterson didn't respond immediately, but his silence was as damning as any confession. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted, growing colder and more detached. "I've seen enough people like her," he muttered. "They think they're untouchable. They walk around with their little perfect lives, their laughter, their friends, happy and carefree, but they don't understand how cruel the world can be." "So you wanted her to understand," Hines concluded. "You wanted to make her suffer." Peterson shook his head vehemently. No, I didn't mean for her to—" He cut himself off and swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I just wanted her to stop screaming. I didn't mean to hurt her." "But you did," Hines said firmly. "You did hurt her. You killed her, didn't you?" His face crumpled, and for the first time tears crept into his eyes. "I didn't mean it to go that far," he repeated. "She fought back. She hit me, clawed at me, and I panicked. I grabbed the scarf around her neck. I just wanted her to stop yelling, to stop looking at me like I was a monster." "Stop looking at you like what you are," Hines corrected, her voice ice cold. His twisted justifications. As Peterson continued to speak, a clearer picture of his psyche emerged. He had rationalized his actions with a warped sense of grievance, blaming the world for his isolation and seeing Sarah as an emblem of everything he both resented and yearned for. "She was so perfect," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Her laugh, the way she walked, she didn't deserve—" He trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. "Deserve what, James?" Hines pressed. "You think you were punishing her for being happy?" "It wasn't like that," he said, quickly defensive. "I wasn't trying to hurt her, I just wanted to talk to her, to make her see me. But then she started screaming and—" His voice cracked again, the weight of his confession crushing him, the weight of his words. By the time Peterson's confession was complete, the room felt suffocating. Every word he uttered carried the weight of the unimaginable pain he'd caused, not just for Sarah, but for her family, her friends, and the entire Winshire community. His motives were as horrifying as his actions, driven by a toxic mix of loneliness, resentment, and a desperate need for control. For Hines, the confession brought both relief and anger. Peterson's words confirmed everything the evidence already suggested, locking his fate in place. But they also revealed the senseless cruelty of Sarah's death, at the hands of a man who saw her as nothing more than a means to fill his own emptiness. As Peterson was led back to his holding cell, Hines sat alone in the interrogation room for a moment, staring at the empty chair across from her. The case was nearly closed, but there was no satisfaction in solving it, only a crushing bitterness for the life that had been taken far too soon. The trial and the verdict. James Peterson's trial began on September 5, 2006, just 9 months after Sarah Watson's tragic disappearance and murder. Though Windsor was a small, quiet town, the case had garnered national attention. News crews parked vans outside the courthouse, their cameras capturing the streams of people, reporters, local residents, and out-of-town visitors, filing in to witness the trial that gripped the nation. For Sarah's family, friends, and the people of Windsor, the trial was about more than determining guilt. It was about justice, closure, and ensuring that James Peterson would never be able to harm anyone else again. As Peterson was marched into the courtroom on the first day, dressed in a neatly pressed suit that clashed with the darkness of his crimes, all eyes turned toward him. His usually pale, wiry figure looked more composed, almost robotic. But for the families seated in the gallery, for Emily Watson, who sat flanked by Sarah's friends and extended family, there was nothing that could mask the emptiness in his presence. To them, he was a man who had extinguished a brilliant light from their community, and no tailored suit could ever disguise his guilt. Opening arguments, a fight for justice. The prosecuting attorney, Abigail Turner, was known for her tenacity and passion in the courtroom. A driven and seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for going after violent offenders, Turner was widely respected across the state. In her opening statement, she painted a vivid, heartbreaking image of Sarah's final moments, detailing Peterson's premeditated choices that made her his target. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Turner began, her voice steady but brimming with passion, "on the night of December 15th, a young girl, bright, full of life, with dreams of becoming an artist, walked home from a night out with friends. She never made it. Why? Because James Peterson watched her, followed her, and made the deliberate choice to rob her of her future." She paused, scanning the jury with an intense gaze. "The evidence will show you that his actions were not impulsive. They were calculated, controlled, and ultimately fatal." Turner walked the jury through the forensic evidence that would later become the backbone of the trial. She described the red scarf found at the crime scene, the rope with Sarah's DNA on its fibers, and the unmistakable fingerprints left on the padlock at the hunting cabin where Sarah was found. She also alluded to Peterson's own confession, which she vowed would leave no doubt in the minds of the jury. The defense team, led by an unassuming but sharp lawyer named Dennis Callahan, took a vastly different approach. Callahan's strategy revolved around casting Peterson as a socially inept man who acted out of panic rather than malice. In his opening statement, Callahan leaned heavily on Peterson's confession to paint a conflicted picture. "This is not a man who woke up that morning intending to take a life," Callahan argued. "He's a man who made a terrible mistake, a mistake compounded by fear and poor judgment. My client was not trying to kill Sarah Watson. He was begging, yes, pleading to be noticed in a world that had cast him aside." His words drew visible anger from Emily Watson, who sat just a few rows behind the defense table. Her knuckles were white as she clenched the edge of her seat, her jaw trembling with barely suppressed fury. To her, and to everyone in the courtroom, Peterson's actions weren't a plea for attention, they were pure evil. The evidence speaks. Over the course of 2 weeks, the prosecution methodically presented their case. DNA evidence tied James Peterson directly to the crime. The hairs found on Sarah's clothing matched his, proving he had been in close contact with her. The rope recovered from Peterson's home matched the type used on Sarah, with additional traces of her blood found embedded in the fibers. The jury also saw video footage from a gas station security camera, time-stamped just hours before Sarah disappeared, which showed Peterson's truck idling near the movie theater. Turner paused the footage, pointing at the grainy figure in the driver's seat. "That man," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering, "waited in his truck, watching Sarah Watson with one intention, to follow her, to make her his victim. Key witnesses sharpened the prosecution's narrative. The gas station attendant described Peterson's unnerving behavior on the night Sarah disappeared. He wasn't buying anything, wasn't looking around like a normal customer, just standing there, watching people, the attendant testified. It gave me the creeps. Rebecca Holt, the neighbor who had first reported seeing a man near the field that night, also took the stand, recounting her uneasy recollections of seeing a stranger lurking by the tree line. Her testimony was simple, but effective. "I wish I'd called someone sooner," she said tearfully. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but maybe it wouldn't have happened if I had." But the most damning piece of evidence came in the form of Peterson's interrogation video, played in full in the courtroom. In it, Peterson is seen breaking under Detective Laura Hines's relentless questioning, admitting in his own words, "She screamed, and I panicked. I just grabbed the scarf to make her stop. I didn't mean to." The courtroom fell silent as his trembling voice spilled from the speakers, his desperation and guilt palpable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Abigail Turner said as the video ended, turning to face the jury, "that is the voice of a man who knew exactly what he had done." The defense's struggle. The defense struggled to break through the prosecution's airtight case. Callahan tried to frame Peterson's confession as the words of a man who was confused, socially isolated, and remorseful. He admitted to being there, Callahan argued, because he's not defending his actions. He's simply misunderstood. But every attempt to soften Peterson's image fell flat against the mountain of evidence and the sheer cruelty of his actions. In cross-examinations, Turner dismantled the defense's narrative with surgical precision. When Callahan suggested Sarah might have provoked Peterson by resisting, Turner's sharp rebuttal silenced the courtroom. "Let me be very clear," she said, her voice resolute. "Sarah Watson is not on trial, James Peterson is, and it was his choice to follow her, to abduct her, and to end her life." The verdict. On September 20th, 2006, after days of tense deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was packed, with dozens of Windsor residents standing outside, anxious for the outcome. Emily Watson sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly with those of her sister Megan. As the four persons stood to deliver the verdict, the room fell into a heavy silence. "On the charge of first-degree murder," the four persons said, pausing briefly, "we find the defendant, James Peterson, guilty." Emily let out an audible gasp, tears spilling down her face as she clutched her sister in an embrace. Around her, murmurs of relief spread through the room. Justice, long overdue, had finally arrived. The judge's sentence was swift and final. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. "Mr. Peterson," the judge declared, her eyes cold, "your actions were calculated, heartless, and irrevocable. You took the life of an innocent young woman, and for that, you will pay with the loss of your own freedom. Forever." As Peterson was led out of the courtroom, emotionless and silent, Emily Watson rose from her seat. She turned to Abigail Turner, her voice breaking with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for fighting for Sarah." A community changed forever. For Windsor, Peterson's conviction brought a measure of closure, but it could never truly heal the wound left by Sarah's death. Her memory lingered in every corner of the small town, the mural painted on her high school walls by her classmates, the bench erected in her honor at the local park, and the stories shared by those who knew her. Emily, though shattered, vowed to keep Sarah's legacy alive. "She was more than a victim," Emily said during a televised interview months after the trial. "She was my daughter, a light in this world, and I'll make sure that light keeps shining." A reminder to everyone. The tragedy of Sarah Watson's death left an indelible mark, not only on her family and the town of Windsor, but on anyone who followed her story. In moments of community reflection, Sarah's story became more than just a harrowing tale of loss. It became a powerful reminder of how fragile life can be, and why vigilance and care are essential in the everyday moments we often take for granted. Her death was a wake-up call, resonating far beyond the quiet borders of Windsor, holding on to awareness in an often unpredictable world. For those who knew Sarah, her disappearance shattered the illusion of safety that many in small, close-knit communities grip tightly. Windsor was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, neighbors looked out for one another, and children walked to school freely. The idea that something so cruel and horrific could happen here felt inconceivable, until it wasn't. Sarah's tragedy reminded people everywhere that danger doesn't always strike from afar. Sometimes it's closer than we'd imagine, lurking where we least expect it. For parents, friends, and community caretakers, her story underscores one vital truth. We can never be too careful. Whether you're in a crowded city or a quiet suburb, it's crucial to reinforce habits that prioritize safety, especially for young people. It's not about living in fear, it's about arming ourselves with the knowledge and instincts to navigate life's risks while still embracing its beauty. Some tips that emerged as key reminders in the aftermath of Sarah's case included: always let someone close know where you're going, who you'll be with, and when you expect to return. A simple text before heading home can provide critical information in case something unexpected occurs. Sarah texted her mom before the movie, and that glimmer of communication shaped the timeline investigators relied on. Whether on a shortcut in the dark, a seemingly empty parking lot, or a secluded running trail, always take a moment to look around. Awareness can often dissuade someone with ill intent. Predators thrive on catching people off guard. Safety in numbers has been a mantra for decades for a reason. It works. Simply walking with a friend can deter situations where someone might see you as vulnerable. Sarah's friends mentioned they wished they'd accompanied her home after the movie, a regret that many sadly echoed. If something feels off, even if it's subtle, act on it. Intuition is often a powerful warning system developed through biological instinct and experience. Rebecca Holt, the neighbor who later testified at Peterson's trial, admitted that she felt uneasy seeing a man lurking near the field but brushed it off as paranoia. Her regret serves as a reminder for all of us to speak up when something doesn't feel right. The role of community. The aftermath of Sarah's case revealed something extraordinary, a surge of strength and solidarity within her town. Winshire's residents came together in powerful ways, not just to help bring justice for Sarah but to ensure their town became a safer, more vigilant community. Vigils were held at the local church. Streetlights were replaced and added along public paths, including the shortcut that Sarah often took. Awareness talks were held at high schools, teaching young people how to recognize warning signs in potentially harmful situations and empowering them to speak out against predatory behavior. Local authorities even implemented safety programs such as safe zones monitored by nearby households and a free rideshare program for individuals traveling alone at night. Neighborly goodwill turned into action, creating a ripple effect that extended beyond Winshire itself. Other communities started essential conversations about security, neighborhood watch programs, and crisis response as Sarah's story spread through newspapers, televised reports, and online forums. However, the most significant change started at home. Families began to have conversations they'd often avoided, about danger, boundaries, safety, and personal empowerment. Parents taught their children more directly about red flags, self-defense, and the importance of staying in touch, while residents of Winshire made small changes in their routines, like checking on one another more often and reporting anything unusual. Her story taught us how fragile safety is, but it also showed us how resilient we can be as a community, a neighbor said during a televised interview. We don't want Sarah to be remembered just as a victim. We want her memory to save others, to remind everyone that we're stronger when we look out for one another. What can we learn? One of the most powerful takeaways from Sarah's story is how prevention and education can break the cycle of tragedy. Predator behavior, as seen in Peterson's case, often hinges on one thing: opportunity. By eliminating or drastically reducing their chances to act, we not only prevent harm but also force these individuals into the open, where their behavior can be identified and addressed. Tips for proactive safety measures include: encourage the use of personal safety devices, such as apps that track real-time locations, send alerts, or connect with emergency services with a single tap. Something like this could act as a lifeline when time is critical. Whether you find yourself in an unfamiliar location or a place you know well, take a moment to familiarize yourself with emergency contacts. This includes identifying the nearest police stations, shelters, or even neighbors you trust. Too often, conversations place responsibility on victims to somehow fend off their attackers or avoid harm. Instead, the focus should be on holding perpetrators accountable and fostering community-level commitment to reducing violence. Sarah didn't do anything wrong, said Emily Watson, her voice trembling during a televised interview. She was walking home. That shouldn't be a risk. People like him, like Peterson, that's where the blame lies. Not with my daughter. Never with my daughter. A critical part of creating safer spaces starts with overcoming the stigma of speaking out. Neighbors, friends, and co-workers often see subtle signs of someone acting suspiciously, just as Peterson's odd behavior was noticed by several people leading up to Sarah's disappearance. Their silence, not born of malice but of doubt and hesitation, was one of the reasons Peterson felt he could act without consequence. Sarah's case became a clarion call to eliminate those hesitations entirely, to encourage everyone to report concerns, no matter how small. A legacy of awareness. Though her life was tragically cut short, Sarah's memory lives on, not just in the hearts of her loved ones but in the lessons her case imparted to a world now more vigilant, more interconnected, and more driven to protect the vulnerable. Her mother, Emily, has worked tirelessly to ensure that Sarah's legacy isn't one of sadness but of strength, empowerment, and hope. Sarah's life inspired the formation of local and national initiatives such as Sarah's Light, a foundation that provides educational tools, self-defense training, and community workshops focusing on personal safety. "We can't change what happened to Sarah," Emily said during an interview following Peterson's conviction. Her voice was weary but resolute, radiating the same quiet strength her daughter was known for. "But we can change what happens next. That's what I want people to take away. Don't wait until it's too late to talk to your kids, your family, your neighbors. Don't assume someone else will step in. Be the person who does." Sarah's story ultimately reminds us of the power of awareness, action, and community. It's a call to watch out for one another, to pay attention to those around us, and to speak up when something feels off. While we cannot erase the pain of her loss, we can honor her memory by ensuring that others are safer, stronger, and more prepared, so that no other family has to experience the heartbreak Emily Watson endures every day.